To John chapter 2, verses 13 through 22. The Passover of the Jews was near, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple, he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and the money changers seated at their tables. Making a whip of cords, he drove all of them out of the temple, both the sheep and the cattle. He also poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. He told those who were selling the doves, "Take these things out of here. Stop making my Father's house a marketplace." His disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." The Jews then said to him, "What sign can you show us for doing this?" Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The Jews then said, "This temple has been under construction for 46 years, and will you raise it up in 3 days?" But he was speaking of the temple of his body. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken. Friends, this is the word of the Lord. Well, I remember years ago when I used to travel and go internationally, and now these days you definitely will use your debit cards, credit cards much more often. But back then you would land and I'd get to the airport and you would see this and you knew that it was not a good deal. All right, but you often had to, okay? You landed at the airport, you're in a different country, you don't have the currency, and you need to take a taxi from the airport to the hotel, and so you had to get some cash. And so you walked up to the currency exchange, and you knew that they were going to rip you off, because you just understood that that was the way it worked. So it looked like a service, but it was actually a ripoff. And this is the crux of the story that we have today, where Jesus goes to the temple and he finds these people who are selling these things that you needed in order to worship. All right. Now, the temple was constructed in a series of layers. And what I mean by that is it was rectangular, so it's not really concentric circles, and it wasn't built from the center out, but kind of the concept of concentric boxes, okay, but just sort of tilted to one side. And so in different passages of Scripture where you hear stories of there was a beggar at this gate or there was a person with an infirmity at that gate, it was referring to different entrances into the various parts of the temple. And what you had was an outer layer, an outer wall and an outer layer, and this was called the court of the Gentiles. And so anyone was allowed in there. So you had a bunch of gates around, a bunch of different entrances, and you could go in there and you're in the court of the Gentiles on the outer layer. There was then a next layer in, and there were these welcoming signs that said that if you're not Jewish and you enter, the penalty is death. Right? And so you were not allowed to go past that point. And by the way, this has, this is ancient times, doesn't really work today. It was called the court of the women. And it was the court of the women because the women were allowed, Jewish women were allowed in that area. And then the next court in was where the offerings were actually brought. And only men were allowed in there, although women could go in if they were making an offering. So while women were making an offering, they could enter, whereas men could be in there all the time. All right? And so what you had were these different layers. Now, that middle area, that court of the women, was where these people were located. And so what they were doing is they were selling animals in order for you to be able to worship. And essentially what would happen is they would just presume, or they would tell you, that whatever animal you brought was not good enough. Okay? So, sorry, that is just not a worship-grade animal. And you need one of these worship-certified animals in order to be able to make your offering. And in previous sermons where we've talked about that passage, the famous passage where they ask Jesus about whether it's lawful to pay taxes, and he says, "Show me the coin that's used to pay the tax," and it was a denarius. And remember, the thing about that coin was that it had the image of Caesar on it, and so you weren't supposed to have one in the temple, and so it was ironic that the people he's questioning happened to have one on them, because you weren't supposed to bring it in the temple because it had an image of Caesar on it. But this is actually a man-made regulation. There was nothing in the Bible that said that explicitly referred to this. It was an interpretation of it. And in fact, throughout the history of the early church, there were many arguments about where's the line between using images and idolatry. And so in the early church, there was a huge debate over what's called iconography, okay? Whether this was permitted or was this crossing the line into idolatry. And it was a matter of human interpretation as to where that line was. So this was actually a human interpretation that said you can't use this coin to make an offering. And so what the money changers were doing is they were saying, oh, well, here. They had special temple coinage. The temple coinage was plain. It had no images on it. And it was not usable in the rest of the empire because it wasn't official Roman coinage. So you got there and you said, I want to make my monetary offering. But what I've got is the money they pay me with at my job, which is going to be denarii. Okay, so I'm going to take a denarius and I want to make my offering. They go, no, you can't do that. You've got to exchange that denarius for temple coinage. And we are happy to offer you this service at only a modestly horrible exchange rate. All right? So this was the currency exchange just at the temple. Now, these rules are artificial, but you can sometimes make these artificial rules sound holy. So here's an example that I like to use. How many of you today are wearing socks? Most of you, right? Okay, most of you are wearing socks. How many of you are wearing socks? I mean, I'll presume they're clean. But how many of you are wearing socks that you have worn before? Like they're laundered? Most of you. How many of you are wearing a brand new pair of socks? You'd never put them on. Oh, okay. All right. There we go. We have one godly person in the room. We have one person who understands that to properly honor God, one must wear socks that have never been worn before. They were never used for a profane purpose. You never wore them to work or to go shopping. You wore these brand new socks for worship. I can make that sound holy. I can make that sound better. And if I convince you that it is better, I've got a brand new pair of socks here that I would be willing to offer to someone who wishes to be more holy for only like $40 a pair. No takers? Good. You take the socks, the offering boxes are in the back. But it sounds like purity. They can make it sound like purity. But it's a man-made rule. It's a man-made rule, and all it did was serve to oppress the people. And this made Jesus angry. And so it says he took a whip of cords, just ropes together. By the way, to be a little clear here, he didn't whip the people. It says he drove all of them out of the temple, both the sheep and the cattle. So he's using this whip of cords to drive the big animals out. So he's just setting the big animals running away. It's costing these people money, okay, because he does that. And then he says he poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables, which you can imagine would have set off a scramble among the people who were gathered there for the money that is now spilling along the ground. So this is just a big money grab now happening there. And it's very clear that Jesus is angry. Okay? Jesus is angry. He was extremely passionate about this because Jesus was passionate about removing obstacles to faith. And this was a real theme of his ministry. What's interesting about this story, which does appear in other Gospels, is that in other tellings of the story, it appears very late in Jesus' ministry. Okay? And there are some people who go, well, how do you reconcile the fact that in one Gospel it happens late and here it happens early? And they're like, well, maybe he did it twice. I'm like, we don't really think that that's the case because we kind of think that after he did it once, the next time, they're kind of on the lookout for him. But what happens here in John's telling of the story is that we're in chapter 2 of the Gospel of John for this passage. And what happens so far is that Jesus was just baptized. He called some disciples. Then he took his disciples and went to the wedding at Cana where they ran out of wine, and he makes 120 gallons of wine for them. All right? And then he goes to the temple and overturns the tables and chases out the animals. So what's clear here is that he's setting a theme for his ministry where he is for people's lives. He is setting a ministry. He is for the people. He wants the people to be able to live into the fullness of their lives the way God intended, whether it was having a celebration at a wedding or going to the temple and being able to worship without obstacles. He was passionate enough about it that he displayed a clearly righteous anger when people were taking advantage of it, because what they were doing in taking advantage of it is that they were getting away from the purpose of the temple. So he says here, stop making my Father's house a marketplace. Now, he's not against commerce in general. All right, the word there that's translated marketplace is a word that has come into English, emporium. It was actually emporion in Greek and becomes emporium in Latin and then became the food emporium in Fort Lee until about 15 years ago or so, if you remember shopping at the food emporium, okay? And it's just a word that meant trading post. And it was officially designated as one. So in the Roman Empire, there were a couple of dozen places that were officially designated as emporia. They were officially designated trading posts. So his point here is simply saying that what you've done is you've made the temple a trading post, all right, as opposed to it being a house of worship. And that's what he's offended by. It's not the existence of emporia in general. It was the specific corruption of the purpose of the temple into having it become an emporium. He's saying, stop placing obstacles in the way of people who are trying to worship. All right? And this is one of the things that we need to do as a church. One of the main goals of a church has to be to remove obstacles to faith. All right? We have to be removing the obstacles that stand between people and worship. For example, Willow Creek was the church outside of Chicago that really started the whole casual worship thing. They went around to people that wanted to start a church. They went around and said, why aren't you going to church? Because, by the way, the decline in mainline church attendance has been every year since 1964. Okay? All right, so it's quite a losing streak that we're on. Okay? I mean, even the Mets have won a World Series between then and now. Okay? All right. So, spring training, got to make a Mets joke. So, they went around and they said, well, what don't you like? They go, well, one of the things was, we don't like dressing up to go to church. Get up in the morning, we don't want to dress up. They're like, great, what if we don't make you dress up? They're like, we want sermons that are relevant to our lives, not these abstract theological things. They go, well, what if we preach that way? They said, if we do this, would you be interested in coming to a church? And they went door to door, and they got all these people who said, yeah, if there was a church like that, I'd consider going. And they developed this contact list, and finally they raised the money to rent a theater for a Sunday, and they had over 200 people at their opening worship. And at their peak, they reached something close to 50,000. Okay? And tens of thousands of churches in the country have preachers today who are wearing jeans to preach, and it's all because of them. All right, because it was talking about trying to remove obstacles. Communion, we're having communion today. Early on in the history of the Presbyterian Church, you only had communion 4 times a year. And in between, the pastor and an elder would come to your house and interview you as to whether you were living a life worthy of receiving communion. And if you were, you got a token. And it was what was called a fenced table. And when on Communion Sunday, you would come, and there would be an elder in front of the table, and you would come forward. They wouldn't serve it out in the pews. You had to come forward, and as you came forward, you had to give a token to the usher, who would then let you through in order to take communion. All right? There's a real tiny Presbyterian denomination today that still practices this, sort of, and they're doing it the old way. Until about 100 years ago, Presbyterian churches had worship in the morning and the afternoon, and you were expected to come to both. And it was a source of great consternation in the denomination around 1905 or so that people weren't coming back for the afternoon service anymore. But there's a little Presbyterian denomination, super conservative, like to the right of the right of the right of the right. And on their website, it says that they still do morning and afternoon worship, that when they have a communion Sunday, you're expected to come to the morning worship. They only do communion at the afternoon service, and in between, the elders would be happy to interview you as to your fitness to take communion if you come back in the afternoon. Okay? Right? At least they put it on their website so that you can read it and go, not for me. All right? The live stream. All right? So we have worship online. Okay? That's removing an obstacle, because getting here is an obstacle to worship. And not only that, but the time. All right? You have to come when we're ready for you. Except that some of the people who are watching on the live stream, some of the people who are hearing me say this, are not hearing me say this on Sunday morning. They're watching the service on Sunday night, or on Monday afternoon, or at the gym on Tuesday, or something like that. Again, it's a matter of trying to remove obstacles that stand between people and faith. Because we don't need more obstacles in our lives. All right? There are too many obstacles that are placed in our lives. We don't need to do that. We need to be people who remove obstacles from other people's lives. And the biggest source of obstacles is ourselves. We're the biggest source of obstacles that stand between where we are and where we need to be in our lives. We make our own obstacles. So often we need to be somewhere and we find out that we're just stuck. And there's a book I was reading recently. It's called Anatomy of a Breakthrough by a professor named Adam Alter. He's a professor at NYU in the Stern School. And he was talking about this concept where the stuckness, the word he used for it was friction. That what you have in your life is friction. You get stuck. Like a lot of times we see something like you have a box on a sloped floor and it stays because that's friction. And what you need to do is once you give it a little push to overcome the static friction, it just slides easily, but you have to supply some energy to overcome the initial friction that has it stuck. And he said that people and businesses and churches need to do what he calls a friction audit. A friction audit is where you simply go through your process and say, where are people getting stuck? Where am I getting stuck? That if you think of all the things that you've wanted to do and then didn't actually do, where did you get stuck? Like he said, businesses will look at their website, for instance, and they may find a lot of people who seem to be finding a product that they like and they add it to their shopping cart and then they never check out. And they go, well, clearly the checkout process is a source of friction. Like I've had that where I get to the final step and I'm like, how do I pay? It's making it very confusing on this really simple act. I'm trying to give you my money and you're not making it easy for me, okay? So friction gets us stuck. And he says that there are three primary, very obvious kind of ways, sources of friction. He says that we have friction that comes from our heart, which is unhelpful emotions. For example, things like fear. Fear is an unhelpful emotion that creates friction, the fear of moving forward, all right? And then there's our head, unhelpful thoughts, a lack of self-confidence, a belief I can't do it, a belief I don't have skills. All of these kinds of things, all right, create an attitude of friction in ourselves. And then there's habit. Habit is an unhelpful behavior, and the thing that I think is really important about this is that it's an unhelpful behavior that already exists, and that's what creates friction. You're not able to move because there's something that you're already doing that's getting in the way. And by the way, he says that if you want to break a bad habit, create friction. And you can create friction. For example, I need to do this. We recently had Girl Scout cookie delivery day. All right? And we have a lot of kids in the church in Girl Scouts. And I order from them all. So I got a lot of Girl Scout cookies. Okay? Too little friction is I put them right next to where I sit to watch TV. Okay? It's a bad place, all right? He says what you need to do is you need to create friction. You create friction. I need to store them on the top shelf of a cabinet in the furthest room from the television, okay, I need to get up and go and have to walk to get them. I need to create friction if I want to break the habit, which is already 50% too late, in order to break that habit. Or you need to look at where are the sources of friction. Like, if you're trying to get out of the house to go somewhere, all right, what gets in the way? All right, I understand kids are friction. It happens. But what are the things that you could do in order to make it a smoother process, in order to cut the friction? What are the things you can pre-position in order to make it easier for you to do what you need to do? There are steps you can take in order to reduce the friction that is in your life between your interest in doing something and actually following through and doing it. Now, one of the things that gets in the way is the structure of a life or the structure of an organization. So Jesus does this. He has effected a structural change in the temple by getting rid of the money changers, getting rid of the animal sellers. What's happening is he's trying to say, look, you can make an offering with the animal you brought. You don't need to buy one. You can make an offering with the money that you brought. You don't need to exchange it. So he makes this structural change, but what immediately happens is the powers fight back. And they go, what sign can you show us for doing this? What are your credentials for doing this? It's institutional power that is locked into a way of thinking that can't see a better way of doing things. And so Jesus says, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. And they immediately presume that what he's talking about is the building, because they can't understand another way of talking about things. And so they go, it's been under construction for 46 years. You know, just because it was there already, just because it's there doesn't mean it should be. But so often, that thing that so much energy has been invested in building up becomes the friction that stops you from moving forward further. What is a source of friction fighting what should be. And this happens in people's lives all the time, and it happens in the church. Like, I'm really excited for the new worship space that's almost done, right? It's a few months away. Not that long, hopefully. Seems to keep getting longer. But, I'm really excited for it. And the reason why I'm excited for it is because the old worship space, I would walk in there, and frankly, in terms of where I think worship needs to be, I would look at it and go, that's a friction pit. It's just friction everywhere. It's long, narrow, dark, hard to equip. I'm like, there's so much we can't do in this space. Day one, when we go into this new space, zero friction. Just about zero friction. It's going to be awesome because, to me, in terms of worship, it's going to be a friction-free worship space. But you know what? Will it be in 30 years? Or 40 years? Or 50 years? I don't know. I don't think so. Right? My successor, 30, 40, however many years down the road, is going to walk in and see a friction pit. Because who knows what worship is going to be like. And what my prayer is that the fundamental structure of it will be such that they will have the guts to gut it. To sit there and say, we need to gut it and redo the inside to fit the way we need to have it fit then. I hope it'll be something they plan rather than like an unplanned fire, okay? It would be nice to have it be something that they can plan for and do, but I hope they have the guts and the resources to look at it and say, this no longer fits what we need in order to remove obstacles that stand between people and the kind of worship that the people can relate to, and therefore we will change it. Because what matters is focusing on what should be, rather than allowing what is to create friction between where you are and where you need to be. See, Jesus, after he does this, his disciples don't even realize the importance of it, and it says that after he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this. After he died for them, they remembered what his focus had been. They remembered that his focus had been on trying to make it easier for people to come to him. That's what the death on the cross, the resurrection is about, is to make it easier for us to be reconciled to God, not harder. The focus of his ministry was removing the obstacles between us and God. And the early church still had to contend with these battles because there were still within the early church the people who were trying to keep obstacles in. So the early church, the book of Acts reminds us that the early church argued over whether they still needed to keep kosher. And there was the faction that said that you do, and there was the faction that said no, that's an unnecessary obstacle to people's relationship with God, and at least the church made the decision to remove the obstacle. And then they had the battle over whether you needed to convert to Judaism, whether a Gentile had to convert to Judaism before they could become Christian. And again, they battled it. And again, there was the faction that favored the institution, the faction that wanted to preserve what was, the faction that said, no, you have to become Jewish first. But they chose to remove the obstacle. The church said, no, we're going to remove this. It is an obstacle that keeps people from coming to God, so we will remove it. The church fought that battle. It continues to fight that battle. There are always those who choose to preserve the obstacles that stand between people and faith, and there will always be those who are saying, no, why are we keeping it when all it does is serve as an obstacle? Jesus wanted no obstacles to be there between us and a relationship with him. What Jesus wanted was for everyone to have a relationship with him, and everything that we do that creates an obstacle between people and their relationship with God is not something that honors Jesus. So we have to remove the friction. We have to remove the friction from the church. We have to remove the friction from our lives, because it is that friction that stands in the way that makes it harder for us to get from where we are to where God wants us to be. And when we remove the obstacles from our lives and from the lives of others, it just makes it more possible for people to have the kind of life and the kind of relationship with God that Jesus got so passionate about in his ministry. Amen.